Dr. Jeheudi, neuropsychologist and school psychologist licensed in private practice. And today we are going to have a conversation surrounding non-traumatic brain injury, erroneous practices in education, his book, Gray Matter Matters, his upcoming book, which we'll talk about further, and what we have in store for the next 3 days in the lecture that he'll be providing at the House of Kuumba. Thank you for joining me, Dr. B.
I'm honored to be here. Thank you so much.
Yes. Okay, so we have a 3-day lecture ahead of us.
Yes.
At the House of Kuumba.
3 days.
Okay. So I'd like for you to tell our viewers a little bit about what they can expect over the next 3 days.
Okay. Well, for the first night, I wanted to be highly interactive because I want to know their concerns, their issues, being educators, being parents, to know precisely what they can gather and gain from these lectures. I want it to be as informal as possible because I understand that your brain can only handle so much. So I think that the interaction would be a nice way for us to discuss these issues that they're concerned about. Tomorrow, Saturday, is a big day. I plan on talking about the physiology of behavior. And I want to discuss it from the perspective that more awareness needs to be made regarding the underlying factors that cause learning difficulties. So I'm going to be talking pretty much from a bottom-up perspective. I want to take a look at the foundation of brain physiology and look at those components that are precursors to learning. And then I want to talk about the requisites for learning. Those are very, very important because typically when we find children who have reading disorders, math disorders, written language disorders, we find that typically those outcomes are never the problem. There tend to be underlying factors, and I'm going to talk about that as well. And then I have a nice surprise on Sunday. We'll be talking about some of the physiological techniques that I use in my practice to remediate those difficulties.
All right. So our community has a lot in store. It's going to open up windows of opportunity for parents and educators, and I'm sure everyone is really looking forward to learning this new information that's going to create, a higher level of understanding about how to interact with their child or someone that they're educating. So with that, I want us to kind of break the ice and talk about some of the language surrounding brain physiology. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit. I would like for you to explain to our viewers about non-traumatic brain injury.
Okay.
Okay, and then we'll get into erroneous educational practices. Okay. And how the two correlate.
Okay.
So that sounds like a lot. I know. Non-traumatic brain injury and erroneous educational practices. So let's start with what is non-traumatic. You have traumatic brain injury, you have not. By the way, viewers, I have the chance to read 80% of this fine piece of work. And so my questions aren't coming from out of the sky. I had the chance to read his book and gain a great understanding of the work that he performs and how it enhances how we practice as parents, educators, social workers. So this is where these questions are coming from. So non-traumatic brain injury, tell us.
Okay, well, non-traumatic brain injury pertains to injuries to the brain that are not caused by head trauma or brain trauma. These injuries tend to occur prenatally. They tend to occur during labor and delivery. Often, this is what we find when we do developmental histories. We find that there's some type of event that caused the child's brain to be damaged. Breech births, when the child's feet down. When the child loses oxygen, when the mother contracts sexually transmitted diseases, when the mother uses drugs and alcohol in pregnancy. These are all factors that create an environment, a toxic environment, particularly drugs and alcohol. They create a toxic environment in which the child really doesn't have a healthy start. Now, unfortunately, you will not see those things occur. Those risk factors, you won't find those things occurring until after the child enters school. And then when the child is, when those different types of academic tasks that require cognitive demands, then you see that child really falter, particularly in attention and memory, with visual spatial processing, which I'll talk about. The other factors would also involve the environment itself and the environment the child is born into. So if the child is born into an impoverished environment, then you'll find children who have brains who really don't function well. Children who are exposed to violence. Children who are exposed to chaotic environments in the home. Those environments tend to be have a negative impact on brain development. So all these factors that I just talked about, that I just described, these collectively are called non-traumatic brain injuries. So when you do a developmental history, you will not find any history of head trauma, like you mentioned, traumatic brain injury. Traumatic brain injury is trauma to the head. Okay? In non-traumatic brain injury, you will find the behavior sequelae almost matching traumatic brain injury insofar as outcomes are concerned.
And so, let's break that down a little bit. Trauma that is not evidenced by anything physical can contribute to a child's inability to learn later on in life.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we're clarifying exactly what Dr. V just said. Trauma that is not physically evidenced can contribute to a child's inability to learn. And what he classifies as trauma is related to environmental factors,
yes,
and trauma prenatal. I want to ask a little bit about emotional trauma by a maternal carrier. So a mother who's pregnant who may be going through some emotional trauma within herself, I'm sure there are hormones that are being released to the unborn child that may also affect. Is that possible?
It is possible, and chronic stress have been found to have a negative impact on brain development. When you're under a lot of stress, your body releases cortisols, releases stress hormones, and those cortisols enter to the child's bloodstream, and they can have a negative impact on the brain. And the type of problems that these children manifest will typically involve the frontal lobe. So higher order thinking, decision-making, problem-solving, those areas tend to be impacted by frontal lobe pathology, you see? So you can have good intelligence, you have normal intelligence, and yet you can have impairments in behavior due to the fact that different regions of the brain is impacted. So executive functions, and I'll talk about that. Executive functions are those abilities that require the individual to respond to environmental demands. Okay? How do I behave? How do I decide? I'm faced with a dilemma, and what decisions do I make? And so individuals who continue to make incorrect decisions tend to have frontal lobe issues.
And in the learning environment, and I'm really thankful for this opportunity to be here, because I myself, who is a school social worker and also in private practice as a clinical social worker, many of my thought processes and questions are coming from that viewpoint. I understand in the learning setting, what you're describing, they often document as critical thinking.
Yes.
Correct?
Yes.
And so when a child is struggling with critical thinking,
yes,
they will streamline them to get tested and to go through a rigmarole of testings to really label them and put them in a box. So I want to segue into erroneous educational practices.
Okay.
So with non-traumatic brain injury, what is a correlation with erroneous educational practices? And describe what we're talking about when we use the terminology erroneous educational practices.
Erroneous educational practices are those practices that are punitive. They tend to be incompatible with the child's ability to perform their particular task. So by punitive, I mean failing grades. By punitive, I mean expulsion. By punitive, I mean retention and suspension. Punitive insofar as the child may develop poor pro-social skills. He may end up in a detention center. Who, because of a misdiagnosis and not understanding the brain-behavior relationship, they're punished for activities that they cannot perform, but they have difficulty. And that's it in a nutshell with the wellness education.
For the most part, they don't even have control. It's something that that child and oftentimes that family group, the family, they have no control. They haven't even identified what the problem is, correct? They haven't even identified. Now, I've recently been working in prison, in juvenile delinquent facilities. And what I'm finding is that some of those behaviors in later development, meaning like 16 to 18, it continues, but they've been streamlined into incarceration.
Yes, that's unfortunate. I'm glad you brought that up. I was assigned to a detention center, juvenile detention center. In my clinical work with those individuals, I found consistent problems with learning and memory and behavior. And the foundation of most of the children that I evaluated were children with severe types of reading and math and written language disorders. They were failing in schools. They were not successful. They were victims of expulsion and or retention. And I explained before that when a child has learning deficits and the child is not attaining to its full academic potential, the risk factors are raised significantly for that child becoming a behavior problem. Now, those behaviors that the child will exhibit out of frustration are sometimes misunderstood to be emotional disturbances. And these are not emotional disturbances. This is just a natural way of the organism responding to task demands that he or she is unable to perform.
In your book, in Gray Matter Matters, there was a scenario of a little boy. His name was Billy.
Okay.
You remember Billy?
Yes, I remember Billy.
Billy was found to have a learning disability while he was in the 3rd grade at age 10, where he struggled with reading and failed the standardized test.
Yeah.
Billy's now 15 years old and in the 9th grade and being recommended for expulsion.
Yes.
His school records show that he's reading at a 4th grade level, but did much better in math. Can you explain a little bit about what that is? Because a lot of our families at home, it's almost like an ongoing grade by grade cycle, you know, of continuous testing, failing testing, exhibiting behaviors that are, you know, school officials cannot control, and then they're being streamlined, and then it happens every school year, back and back. And parents are just losing hope around solutions.
Right.
So, what is that all about?
Well, what it's about is the fact that educators focus on academic skill-based assessments. And academic skill-based assessments will give you levels, grade levels, and so forth. But they won't tell the picture in terms of why the child is struggling. Now, you have conditions where you can do good in math and poor in reading.
Okay.
And often that type of math is impacted are what we call the visual spatial processing. So if you're good with visual spatial processing, you do good with that type of math, right? Lining up numbers, doing figures, angles, and so forth. However, when it comes to word problems, when you're doing reading word problems like reading comprehension, then you see reading difficulties and things. So academic skill testing primarily looks at levels in which the child is 1st grade level, 2nd grade, so forth. But it doesn't touch the processes, the underlying processes that are causative to reading. Now, I talk about reading as a behavior.
Okay. And
to understand behavior called reading, then you need to understand that when that behavior is impacted because it's dysfunctional, the child's having difficulty with it, then you have to link it back to those processes in the brain that are also impacted as well. So, for an example, a child with dysphonetic dyslexia, dysphonetic dyslexia typically is a disorder of the left hemisphere in an area of the brain called the plana temporale. That area of your brain is necessary for phonological processing. So when you have that problem and you're just remediating the academic aspects of that type of dyslexia, the child will typically not move forward.
Wow.
Very, very frustrating for the child, the parent, and for the teacher.
It's very frustrating. And I've seen it where year in and year out, each year the testing is just yielding the same results.
Yes.
And the families are like, now the child is like, just like Billy, first he started in 3rd, now he's in the 9th grade.
Yes.
I've gotten cases where a family, you know, I get the file, I conduct the biopsychosocial,
right.
and then I'm like, but where did he fall in the cracks?
Right.
Why are we just now getting
right.
this issue in the 10th grade?
Right.
He's been in school for 10 years.
Well, I call that flatlining in my book, where children make no academic progress, they just go along the line. And again, that's typical for interventions that primarily focus on academic skill-based. What the research shows that you need a combination of factors in order for the child to be successful. You do need academic skill-based teaching. You do need that. Instruction is very, very important. But you also need to support that with the processing-based approach that working in combination shows that it's more effective. So you have some good research out there that shows that combination works really well. So if you're just focusing on academics alone, then the child will struggle. If you only focus on a process-based approach alone, will have very little impact. It has to be a combination of both in order for the child to
like multifaceted.
It has to be multifaceted, multisensory, if you will, which is a good approach of handling children with those type of problems, because you're looking at various brain systems and you're integrating those various brain systems to move forward, you see? So you have these children, and I was so concerned about them from working with them over 15 years, that they were not making progress, despite some of the best efforts by some of the best teachers, and that's the puzzling thing. You can have the best teachers working very hard, and I know some teachers in Dade County schools who are very, very hard-working teachers, master teachers. However, they have children in their classrooms that, despite their efforts, their children fail to make the progress that they would like to see.
Well, that's what leads us to where we are today in the Black Homeschool Network. It was established to really create some kind of order for a child who might not fit into that cookie-cutter learning setting. The teachers are cookie-cutter as well.
Yes.
They're not designed, teachers are not being taught to be holistic. They're being taught, the teachers are learned in a cookie-cutter way as they are teaching the students.
Well, it's a curriculum-based model, and the curriculum-based model is one in which all children learn the same thing at the same time.
Absolutely.
And it doesn't take into account individual differences, and it certainly does not take into account physiology, the child's physiology, which may be a little different. So the child has to learn a little different. So I will be talking about the 4 kinds of learning, and to help, or at least to raise awareness that there are different types of mechanisms in the brain that are receptive to certain type of interventions at certain period at a time in the child's life. So when they're introduced too early, the child may not respond. If they're introduced too late, the child will not respond. So windows of opportunity is very critical for educators to understand, when do I introduce a particular concept? Now, if you study Piaget, which wrote a lot extensively on cognitive development and behavior, looking at his model alone,
stages.
Okay, looking at his one model, you'll find that education today, particularly in public education, it still tends to be a mismatch between developmentally appropriate practice and the child's readiness. And sometimes you can introduce these concepts too early and the child is not ready for it, so it may seem as if the child has a learning problem. In fact, the child doesn't.
They just weren't ready for that information.
They were not ready for it.
So traditional learning environments aren't always suitable for all children. And that's how the Black Homeschool Network came to take form, and many homeschool families came to decided to take learning on their own hand. Who knows their child better than the parent themselves?
Absolutely.
And that's how homeschooling. But the homeschool family will run into some of these issues as well.
Sure.
So how does neuroscience play into this whole healing process around identifying non-traumatic brain injury and trying to come up with solutions to working with the child?
Well, I understand the frustration of homeschoolers, homeschool educators. I understand the frustration. Their frustration is the same as the ones working in the classroom. Neuroscience is critical for education in order to understand how the brain learns. You see? So homeschool educators, like professional educators in school systems, they both need training in neuroscience to understand those mechanisms that are responsible for learning and to capitalize on those precursors when the timing is appropriate for that child to learn. So the homeschool network will be greatly advanced if they embrace the concept of neuroscience and they inculcate those into their practices, and they will see children make significant success. Most programs that are developed outside of the traditional schools, if you were typically developed because of frustration by someone who says, you know, my child is not received, he's not moving forward. And so a lot of times out of frustration, the intentions are good, but the practice are basically the same.
They continue with
the same practices.
Yeah. Modality. The same modality.
It's the same modality.
Yeah.
The frustration may be lessened in the fact that, well, I'm doing it. And so the perception of, well, I'm doing it, so since I'm doing it, I should see some improvement. But a lot of times I have to admit that even in public schools, sometimes teachers go to private schools, or they may go to charter schools, if you will, only to return to the school system again because they're finding the same things occurring.
Absolutely.
So you really need to see a change, and this is what neuroscience does. It changes the concepts of how we educate children. And in order to do so effectively, you must have an understanding, helping children understand that other people have different perspectives of certain events or different phenomena, and how to embrace those and understand.
You know, for me as a clinician, I'm about the business of healing.
Yes.
And trying to work through emotional challenges that lead to behavioral challenges.
Yes.
But what you've introduced to me just through dialogue, through reading your book and having a conversation like this with you, I'm understanding that awareness is just not enough.
No, it's not enough.
Because, you know, we have this idea, we tend to feel, and it's out there, you know, we have the internet, and we tell ourselves these stories, you know, you practice something for 30 days or longer, and it'll change the habit, you'll form a new habit. Or we tend to feel like we have a handle on things. Particularly, those of us who may have a stronger awareness about our consciousness,
yes,
we may think that understanding our history is more than enough, yes, to move us forward. But when we have non-traumatic brain injury and brain physiology that plays a role, you know, there's a missing link. So can you kind of touch on that for us?
Well, there's been some good research that has been done that shows clearly that raising awareness does not necessarily lead to behavioral change. And talking therapies will probably be around for a long time. However, talking
take us out of the job yet.
But talking therapies have their limitations. And regarding brain physiology, as we know, the brain is plastic, which means that the brain can recover very nicely from injury. With the appropriate interventions, we can impact behavioral change. But you have to focus on and change the physiology of the brain, and that can happen now. We have that technology available to us now that we can change brain physiology. This is a new concept in neuroscience. These things were not known previously because we assumed that once the thinking at one particular point was once the child was born, that he had this full quota of neurons and nothing else would change. He will not be able to create new neurons if the brain was injured, but that thinking is gone now. We now know that the brain does reproduce new neurons. We know that when the brain is injured, it has the power to recover given the appropriate interventions. And this is what we do with children in my practice who come to us for learning difficulties, behavioral difficulties. And we focus on the physiology by looking at the brain. We do EEG, neurofeedback. Okay. So we're studying the brain physiology through EEG, and we can take a look at brainwave patterns that tell us that the child's brain, there's certain systems that may be not performing as well because there's either overactivation of activity or there's underactivation of activity. And the goal of neurofeedback is to correct those deficiencies, and by correcting those deficiencies, we see a change in behavior. Now, you have some really, really good research on children with attention deficit disorder and EEG neurofeedback. There's been numerous studies that have been published that shows that children with attention deficit disorder do respond favorably to EEG neurofeedback and without side effects. And sometimes these changes that they've made by reversing some of the symptoms of attention deficit disorder tend to be permanent.
Wow.
They tend to be permanent.
That's profound.
So you can have, I want you listeners to understand that because there may be brain deficits, it's not a death sentence. You know, that many things can be done to correct those deficiencies.
The brain is like plastic. Dr. Boy said it himself. It's recoverable.
It's recoverable.
It's recoverable. It can be repaired. There are tools out there to help to change the physiology, to help improve behavior, and there are ways to find solutions that are beyond just an increased awareness.
Well, I like the word solution. That's what we are doing. Gray matter neurobehavioral solutions.
Yeah.
We provide solutions for children with those type of problems.
Yeah, no, I love the solution-focused model in general, just as a clinician, and I think it's important to look at these situations as far as, you know, what kind of solution can we find, and look at the child as a whole person. As I shared with you, you know, I don't have the technology as a therapist. To see brain physiology. The most I can do is refer a client to you and take that information and incorporate it into, you know, my work. But I do feel that, you know, people, our communities that are struggling, I mean, we have many risk factors, and we're constantly looking at what the problem is.
Right.
And coming from a problem-based, you know, we can talk about economic disadvantage.
Yes.
We can talk about our school communities not having finances to supply materials and to educate our children the way we think they should be educated. We can talk about our children growing in small spaces. You talked about spatial inference.
Yes.
I know years ago I read, and you know, talk about children struggling with math when they come from communities where they're limited their space, you know,
yes.
their environment. We can talk about all these problems, but there are also solutions.
Yes.
To all of these many, and instead of looking at the child as like, okay, this is a problem, we can say, you know, this is a whole person. Yes. Right?
Yes. Truly a whole person, and I certainly like the thinking. I'm not a proponent of the deficit model.
Okay.
Because that tends to breed too much negative energy, and it tends to lower a person's self-esteem.
Yes.
You can create in the mind of the person a mindset that promotes a kind of helplessness in that particular person. Well, if this is the way I am now, and I have all these deficits because people keep telling me that there's something wrong with me, then what's the use?
Absolutely.
So by looking at problems and creating solutions for those problems, gives the person tremendous advantage in the healing process, as you just mentioned.
Yeah, it's a part of the healing.
Sure.
And then there's a sense of hope.
Yes.
And I think that's lost because many of the children, I mean, we know that standardized testing, especially in the state of Florida, I read where they build prison cells based on FCAT scores.
I've heard the same.
In the state of Florida. So we know that, you know, our children, they're trying to streamline our children. You know, they're trying to streamline our children. And I recently read an article, I don't have it with me, so I can't quote the source, but it said that soon, standardized testing in the state of Florida will be transformed and be designed based on cultural competence and cultural background.
Okay.
So, you know, a child that might be identified as Asian, you know, from Asia,
yes.
Their test would be different.
Yes.
I read this in an article recently.
Interesting.
And I found that very interesting. And it hasn't happened as yet. It will be implemented.
Interesting.
Okay. So these are other factors that will change the way, you know, we play the game as service providers too. Having a greater understanding of how children are you know, in their learning environment, how they're being challenged.
Yes. Well, identify the problem, and then provide interventions that will resolve the problem. But the problem itself must be identified. If you can't really identify the problem, then you cannot resolve the problem. And it's called in this, what I call in my book, the cycle of failure.
Okay.
The cycle of failure is a person who's just caught in to a cycle in which the child cannot get out of. We want the child to move forward. So diagnostics is a critical piece of the healing process. Very, very critical. Identify the problem, understand the problem completely. That concept must be understood completely.
Clearly. So we can't be afraid to identify what exactly we're working with. Because sometimes there's fear in a family setting surrounding finding out exactly what the problem is. You know.
Well, the fear is because of the unknown. And so, see, the fear is a state of mind. It's a state of mind. You see, people are typically not born with fears, and I'm going to talk a lot about this weekend in my lectures. You're not necessarily born with them, but you can create the environment, create the environment in which the child's physiology is subjected to trauma, for an example, and this creates biochemical changes in that child's brain. And now the brain is now firing on its own those mechanisms that contribute to anxiety and depression or other problems as well. So you have to again really understand what the problem is and know that there is a solution to the problem. But if the problem is not understood, the concept is not understood, then you're going to have some type of apprehension and anxiety because you don't know necessarily what road to take in terms of remediate that problem.
Remediation. Well, Dr. B, this has been amazing.
It is amazing.
This is a wonderful conversation. You know, I can see this going even further into talking about more specifics around solutions and talking more, you know, academic approach, and we can take this all over the place. But we're going to have to close because we don't want to give everything about what's happening in the lecture. And I'm sure there are going to be more lectures with you, right?
Yes. Looking forward to it.
More lectures ahead. So for now, we're gonna close our session today. I really thank you for sharing the information that you shared with our community, and I hope that, you know, this information will plant a seed. It planted a seed in my life, and I really hope that it will plant a seed in our viewers, in their lives, and spark, you know, attention towards nurturing a whole child. And meeting their needs and meeting that child where they are, and possibly coming to get services. Yes,
we look forward to it. As I said before, we welcome parents to come, particularly those children who have not responded to intervention. And this is our best population. You know, the parents do come to us now. They're frustrated parents. They have seen their children fail continuously. They've seen their children expelled from school. They've seen their children retained in school in grades. And so we try to make ourselves, parents, know that there are solutions to their child's problems.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we'll close with that.